What happens when one of the most powerful men in Hollywood sits across from a morning show host who decides today is the day to push every single button, and the man across from him decides he is done being polite about it? That is exactly what unfolded on national television when Tyler Perry took a seat on the Good Morning America couch, and what started as a standard press run turned into one of the most talked about moments in daytime television history. If you have ever watched someone go from composed to completely done in real time, you already know what kind of energy this story carries. Stay with me, because nothing about this is what you expect. And before we get into it, drop a comment down below and tell me, do you think celebrities have a right to shut down an interview when things go too far? And make sure you are subscribed, because we break down moments like this all the time. Now, to understand how this moment landed the way it did, you have to understand who Tyler Perry is and what he represents, not just in Hollywood, but to the people who have followed his journey from sleeping in his car to owning his own studio. Tyler Perry built everything he has from the ground up, without the backing of major studios, without the cosigns that most people need to get a foot in the door, and without ever apologizing for the kind of storytelling he believed in. He took hits from critics for years. He was dismissed, mocked in think pieces, and talked about like he was a cautionary tale instead of a blueprint. And through all of that, he stayed working. He stayed building. And by the time the world caught up to what he had actually accomplished, he was already a billionaire, sitting on top of a studio that he owned outright in Atlanta, Georgia. That context matters because it is the armor he walked into that interview with. Michael Strahan, on the other hand, is not exactly a lightweight either. The man went from being a dominant force on the football field to becoming one of the most recognizable faces in morning television. He is charming, he is quick, he is comfortable in front of a camera in a way that very few people are. And he has a natural ability to make interviews feel loose and conversational. Most guests love that about him. It disarms people. It makes them say things they might not say in a more formal setting. And that quality, that ability to pull people into a kind of casual candor, is exactly what made what happened between him and Tyler Perry so explosive. Because Tyler Perry is not most guests. The interview started the way these things typically do. There was the back and forth about upcoming projects, the kind of promotional energy that morning shows run on. Tyler was there, engaged, professional, hitting all the marks that a seasoned media personality knows to hit. Strahan was doing his thing, keeping the energy light, getting the audience warmed up. And then, somewhere in that early stretch of conversation, something shifted. It was subtle at first, a question that landed a little differently than the ones before it, not offensive on its surface, but carrying a weight underneath it that Perry clearly felt immediately. Strahan leaned in and said, with that easy smile that makes everything sound like friendly conversation, "You know, there are people out there, critics, industry folks, who say that the Tyler Perry formula has started to feel a little predictable, that maybe it is time to reinvent the wheel a little bit. What do you say to that?" The studio audience laughed lightly, the way audiences do when they can feel something interesting is about to happen. Perry did not laugh. He looked at Strahan for just a moment, the kind of look that people who have been underestimated their entire lives recognize immediately. It is not anger yet. It is the recognition that this is about to become a different kind of conversation than the one that was advertised. Perry straightened slightly and said, "I think that is a fascinating question to ask a man who has built the only black-owned major film studio in the history of this country. Predictable, I want to sit with that word for a second, because I think what people mean when they say predictable is that they can see themselves in what I make. My audience knows what they are coming for, and what they are coming for is a reflection of their own lives." Now, I have been hearing some version of this critique since the very beginning, and I want to be honest with you, Michael, I stopped letting it bother me a long time ago, but I also stopped pretending that the critique is coming from a neutral place. It never is. Strahan nodded, doing what good hosts do, absorbing the response without letting it close the door on the tension. He said, "I hear you on that. I do, but let me push a little, because I think you can handle it. When you look at filmmakers who have evolved their style over time, who have taken risks that surprise their audiences, do you ever feel the pull to do something completely outside of what people expect from you? Or is the formula itself the point?" And that was the moment, not the answer, the question, because embedded in that question was something that Perry had been hearing for his entire career, dressed up in different language. The suggestion that success built for a specific audience is somehow lesser than success built for the critics. The implication that because his audience is loyal and consistent, there must be something limiting about what he is offering them. Perry heard all of that in the word formula, and he was not going to let it pass. He set down the coffee mug he had been holding, slowly, and looked directly at Strahan, and said, "I want to make sure I understand the question. Are you asking me if I want to make different movies so that a different group of people will respect me more? Because if that is the question, the answer is no, and I want to be very specific about why." The audience had gone quiet. Not uncomfortable, quiet, riveted, quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when a room full of people all realize at the same moment that they are watching something real. Perry leaned forward slightly and continued. I spent the early part of my career being told that what I was making was not real cinema, that it was too broad, too melodramatic, too rooted in a church culture that mainstream Hollywood did not understand and did not want to understand, and I kept making it anyway, not because I was being stubborn, not because I was incapable of doing anything else, but because I knew who I was making it for. I knew exactly who was going to sit in that theater on a Friday night after a hard week and need to see something that told them their life mattered, that their struggle was worth putting on a screen, that their faith, their family, their pain, all of it, deserved to be the center of a story. So when you use the word formula, I need you to understand what you are actually describing. You are describing intention. You are describing a man who has always known exactly what he is doing and why. Strahan held his ground, which is one of the things that separates him from hosts, who fold the moment a guest pushes back. He said, I respect that, Tyler. I genuinely do, and I am not trying to diminish the audience you serve, but I think there is a version of this conversation where we can acknowledge the loyalty of that audience and still ask whether there is more on the table, because you are a man of enormous talent, and some people who admire you deeply wonder if we are getting the full range of what you are capable of. Perry looked at him for a long moment, and the look on his face was not hostility exactly. It was something more complicated than that. It was the expression of a man who has heard something that sounds like a compliment but knows better. He said, Michael, I appreciate that. I do, but I want to unpack what just happened there, because I think it is important. You just told me that the people who admire me most wonder if they are getting the full range of what I am capable of, which means they have decided, without asking me, that what I have already built is not the full range, that there is some version of Tyler Perry that is more impressive than the one sitting in front of you right now. And I want to ask you something directly. What would that version look like? What would he need to make? What audience would he need to be making it for? Because I have a feeling that the version of me that would satisfy that particular curiosity does not look like me at all. The audience stirred. A few people in the front rows shifted in their seats. Strahan paused, and it was a genuine pause, not a performative one. He was actually considering the question. When he responded, his tone had shifted just slightly, not backing down exactly, but recalibrating. He said, I think what I am getting at, and maybe I have not said it as cleanly as I should have, is that there is a segment of the industry that has kept you at arm's length. The awards circuits, the critical establishment, the festivals. And I wonder if that bothers you, or if you have made peace with it. Perry almost smiled. Almost, he said. Now that is a more honest question, and I will give you a more honest answer. It used to bother me. I will not sit here and pretend it did not. There was a time when I wanted that validation the way anybody wants to be recognized by their peers. But then I started looking at what was actually being rewarded in those spaces, and I started asking myself, rewarded by whom, and for whose benefit? And the more I examined it, the more I realized that the gatekeeping in those rooms is not about quality. It is about familiarity. It is about whether the story being told fits the sensibility of the people doing the judging. And my stories have never been made for those people. So their opinion of my work is a little bit like a food critic reviewing a dish they have decided ahead of time is not for them. What exactly is that review worth to me or to the people who eat at my table every day? Strahan pressed. Because that is his job, and he is good at it. He said, but you have the resources now. You have the studio, you have the relationships, you have everything you would need to make a film that goes after all of it. The awards, the critical attention, the crossover conversation. Is there a part of you that wants to prove something on that level? Or have you genuinely moved past the need to prove anything to anyone? And this is where the conversation crossed from spirited into something raw. Because Perry looked at Strahan and said, Michael, I want you to think about what you are actually asking me. You are asking me if I want to change what I make, who I make it for, and why I make it, so that a group of people who have historically ignored, dismissed, or condescended to black storytelling will finally give me a trophy. And I have to be honest with you, I find that to be a deeply strange thing to suggest to me. On television, in front of all these people, I find it strange because you would not walk up to a man who has built $1 billion business from nothing and ask him if he feels the need to prove something. The business is the proof. The studio is the proof. The audience that has shown up for me for over 2 decades is the proof. The only thing a trophy would prove is that I cared what those particular people thought, and I stopped caring a long time ago, and I am better for it. The audience responded this time, not with polite applause, but with the kind of reaction that comes from a room full of people who felt something in what was just said. Strahan let it breathe. He was smart enough to let that land before moving. When he did speak again, his tone had changed, not softened entirely, but there was a new kind of respect in it. The kind that comes from being challenged by someone who is not performing their confidence but actually living inside it. He said, okay, I hear you, and I want to be transparent with you because I think this conversation deserves that. Some of what I have been asking comes from a real place of curiosity. I have watched your career from the outside for a long time, and there are things I genuinely do not understand about how you see yourself in relation to this industry. But I also want to acknowledge that some of what I have asked you today might have carried an assumption in it that I did not fully examine before I asked it. And if that landed wrong, I want to own that. It was a gracious thing to say, and Perry heard it as such. But he was not done, because the thing about a man who has been measured against the wrong standards his entire life is that when he finally gets a platform to respond in full, he does not stop at gracious. He goes all the way. He said, I appreciate that, Michael, I genuinely do, and I am not angry. I want to be clear about that. What I am is tired. Not tired in the way that makes a man quit, tired in the way that makes a man stop explaining himself to rooms that were never meant to understand him in the first place. I have had this conversation, some version of it, for my entire career. And the reason it keeps coming up is not because my work is insufficient. The reason it keeps coming up is because there are people who are genuinely uncomfortable with the idea that an entire audience, a massive, loyal, passionate audience, found exactly what they were looking for in something that was never designed to impress the people asking the questions. Strahan nodded slowly and said, so let me ask you this then, and I am asking this honestly, not as a challenge. What do you want people, not your audience, but people who maybe have not given your work a fair chance? What do you want them to understand about what you have built? Perry looked at him and said, I want them to understand that their discomfort with what I make is information about them, not about me. I want them to sit with the fact that they can watch almost any kind of story, centered on almost any kind of experience, and call it universal. But the moment a story is centered on the specific, lived, spiritual, complicated, joyful, painful truth of a particular Black American experience, suddenly it becomes niche. Suddenly, it becomes a formula. Suddenly, it needs to evolve or justify itself. And I want them to ask themselves honestly why that is. Because I know why it is. And I think they do too. The studio had gone completely still again. Strahan looked at him for a moment before he said anything. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been at any point in the interview. He said, you know what? That is one of the most direct things I have heard anyone say on this show in a long time. Perry said, I have been waiting a long time to say it. And just when it seemed like the conversation had reached a kind of equilibrium, like both men had found the mutual respect that was underneath the friction all along, Strahan did something that nobody in that studio expected. He pivoted. Hard. He said, I want to shift gears for a second, because there is something else I have been wanting to bring up, and I think after everything you just said, now is actually the right time to do it. Perry looked at him with that same steady energy and said, go ahead. Strahan said, there have been conversations in recent months, and I am not talking about gossip. I am talking about real industry dialogue, about the way productions operate at your studio, the hours, the working conditions, the pace of output. And the question that keeps coming up is whether the volume of content you produce comes at a cost to the people making it. I want to give you the chance to respond to that directly. The temperature in the room changed immediately. Not dramatically, not with any kind of obvious theatrical shift. But if you were watching closely, and the cameras certainly were, you could see something move across Perry's face. It was not panic. It was not guilt. It was the look of a man who has just been handed something he did not come there to discuss and is now deciding, in real time, exactly how he wants to handle it. He was quiet for just a moment, and then he said, okay, so we are doing this. It was not a question. Strahan said, I think you are someone who can handle a real conversation. Perry said, I can handle any conversation. What I cannot handle is the framing that just came with that question. Because you said real industry dialogue, and what you mean is that some people who do not work for me, and in some cases have never worked for me, have opinions about how I run my business. And you are presenting that to me as though it carries the same weight as an actual investigation or an actual finding. It does not, Strahan said, but there have been people who have worked for you who have spoken about it. Perry said, there have been people who have worked for me who have spoken about it. That is true, and there have been many more people who have worked for me who would tell you an entirely different story. The question is, which voices get amplified and why? And I think if you examine that question honestly, you will find that the voices questioning how I run my studio get amplified because they fit a narrative that certain people in this industry are very invested in. The narrative that Tyler Perry's success is somehow suspect, that it must come with a catch, that there must be something exploitative underneath it because they cannot fully account for how it happened through any other explanation. Strahan leaned in and said, I do not think it is that conspiratorial, Tyler. I think people hear about a studio that produces content at the rate yours does, and they ask legitimate questions about sustainability and labor, Perry said. And those would be legitimate questions if the same people were asking them about every studio operating at high output. But they are not. So the question is selective, and selective concern is not genuine concern. It is a talking point. And I have been the subject of enough talking points in my career to know one when I hear it dressed up as journalism. There was a murmur in the audience. Not against Perry, not against Strahan, exactly. but the kind of collective murmur that a crowd makes when they are watching something that is genuinely unscripted and they are not sure where it is going. Strahan did not retreat. He said, "So your position is that the criticism is not valid?" Perry said, "My position is that the criticism has not been applied consistently, which means it is not really about the principle it claims to be about. If you are going to talk about working conditions in Hollywood, I am very happy to have that conversation in full. Let us talk about every studio. Let us talk about every production. Let us look at the whole picture. But do not come to me specifically, on a morning show, and ask me to defend my business practices as though I am uniquely responsible for problems that exist across the entire industry. That is not a fair conversation. That is a setup, and I respect you too much to pretend it is anything else." Strahan said, "I do not think I set you up." Perry said, "I do not think you meant to. I think you walked in here with a list of things you wanted to cover, and this was on the list, and you asked it the way it was written, and I am not angry at you for that. But I am going to tell you what I tell everybody who comes at me with this particular angle. I employ hundreds of people who came from communities that Hollywood had no interest in hiring, people who built careers at my studio who would not have been given a second look anywhere else. And the idea that my commitment to those people is somehow a liability, the idea that the pace at which we work is a problem rather than a reflection of a work ethic that I built my entire life around. That idea does not come from a place of genuine advocacy. It comes from a place of discomfort with what I represent, which is that you do not need their permission. You do not need their systems. You do not need their validation. You can build your own, and it can be bigger than what they were willing to offer you. And that makes some people very uncomfortable." Strahan was quiet for a beat, and then he said something that was either very brave or very unwise, depending on which side of the conversation you were sitting on. He said, "But does it ever concern you, honestly, that some of the people raising these questions are black creatives? People who are not coming at you from a place of industry bias, but from a place of genuine concern about the culture you have built." And Perry stopped, not in a way that suggested he was caught off guard, in a way that suggested he was choosing his next words with the kind of care that only comes from knowing that what you say next is going to matter. He said, "Yes, that concerns me more than anything else you have said today, not because I think it is accurate, but because I understand how it happens. I understand that in an industry where resources are scarce, where opportunities are limited, where the same doors get closed in the same faces year after year, it is very easy to look at somebody who broke through and ask why. They are not using what they built to fix everything the industry broke. I get that. I carry that. I think about it more than people know. But what I will not do is accept the premise that because I could do more, anything I have done is insufficient. What I will not do is stand in front of an audience that has supported me through everything and apologize for what I built because it did not also solve every systemic problem on its way to existing. I am one man. I built one studio, and I have done more with it than most people believed was possible when I started. That is not arrogance. That is just the record." Strahan said, "And the people who are still critical, what do you say to them?" Perry said, "I say come talk to me directly. Do not go on a podcast. Do not give a quote to a reporter. Do not go on a morning show and let somebody ask questions on your behalf. Come to me, because I have always been reachable. I have always been willing to have a hard conversation with someone who is willing to have it honestly. What I am not willing to do is respond to every secondhand criticism as though it carries the weight of fact. I am not going to keep defending myself in rooms I am not in. What I will do, what I have always done, is keep building, keep working, keep showing up for the people who show up for me, and let the work speak for itself, the way it always has." There was a long pause. Strahan looked at him and said, "You know, I came in here thinking this was going to be a standard interview." Perry said, "It never is. Not with me." Strahan smiled, a real one this time, and said, "I am starting to understand that." Perry said, "Good, because I think you are better than the version of this interview that we almost had, and I think your audience deserved the real version." Strahan said, "I think you might be right about that." And Perry said, "I usually am." The audience laughed, for the first time in a while, genuinely and fully, and in that laughter was the release of everything that had built up over the course of that conversation. The tension, the honesty, the discomfort, the respect, all of it dissolved for just a moment into something lighter. But what stayed? What you could see in the way both men carried themselves through the final moments of that interview was that something real had happened, not a fight, not a tape, something more lasting than either of those things. Two people who were not going to agree on everything, who were not going to pretend they did, who sat across from each other and refused to make it easy, and in doing so, made it unforgettable. Because that is what happens when you put a man who has never needed anyone's approval in a chair across from someone skilled enough to actually test that claim. You find out quickly whether the confidence is real. And Tyler Perry, whatever you think of his work, whatever side of the industry debate you sit on, walked into that studio the same man he walked out as, unbothered, unbroken, and completely, almost defiantly, himself. And that, more than any single thing said in that room, is is the thing that nobody who watched it could stop talking about. So here is the question I want to leave you with today. Do you think Tyler Perry handled that interview the right way? Or do you think there was a moment where he should have pulled back? Drop your answer in the comments below, because I genuinely want to know where you stand on this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Hit that button right now, because we break down moments like this all the time, and you do not want to be the last one to the conversation.